Hey everyone, it's been over 2 minutes and I haven't been raped yet. What is wrong with the patriarchy? Hi, I'm Diana Davison, a Canadian men's rights activist. I've been spending the last week researching a case called Hawley versus Ham, which is from 1826, Kingston, Ontario. I've been looking into this to find out if feminists lie. As it turns out, they do. In a book called Defending Battered Women on Trial, Elizabeth Sheehy states that the case of Hawley versus Ham was precedent-setting and that it was unreported. Unreported means that there was no official transcript of the trial, there was no official record, so the only record available was a newspaper report at the time. Well, Elizabeth Sheehy got a government grant for research with which to purchase transcripts of trials. I did not. It took me 5 minutes to find the trial transcript, which is called A Report of the Case of Hawley versus Ham, or something like that. There's a link to it below. It's also free to you, and I suggest that you read it. It's a really awesome story, almost a soap opera of the time. And the case was Hawley, which is the father of a man's wife, and George Ham, who was the man. This case was not actually a case of wife battery, as he would like it to look. This was a case about alimony. There were lots of precedents in this case, but it didn't set any. The precedents in this case were ones brought up by Shelden Hawley's lawyer in order to try and get money out of George Ham, and all of those precedents are probably the reason why Elizabeth Sheehy wanted to pretend that there wasn't a transcript. They're quite revealing. As opposed to the feminist narrative about how oppressed women were and how hard it was for them to leave their abusive husbands, the question here wasn't whether or not George Ham beat his wife severely enough to justify her leaving. It was whether or not he had beaten her to an extent that made him culpable for payments for her upkeep. So the laws that she quotes about a man being allowed to moderately chastise his wife, and chastise is a pretty general word, so we don't really know what that means, makes it sound like a woman had to put up with a beating and she wasn't allowed to leave the home unless that beating actually threatened her life. Those rules were relating to whether or not a man was responsible for alimony or upkeep from a woman he married who was not living with him. One of the precedents that was brought up by Shelden Hawley's lawyer was a woman who had actually eloped. She'd left her husband and she'd moved in with another lover. And that lover wanted to get paid for her upkeep. And the case that went before the court was actually the husband charging with the man with seducing his wife and taking her away from him. And we don't have the transcript for that, so we don't know if the husband had actually been beating her or not. That precedent was basically just to establish that any woman who was being taken care of by another party had the right to maintenance from a husband if they could show they'd been put out. There was also a case where a woman eloped, and then I guess it didn't work out for her, so she wanted to go back to her husband. He said no. If a man refused to let a woman live with him that was his wife, then he was also responsible for alimony. So the case Hawley versus Ham is actually a case about alimony. It's not like we imagine today's cases where a woman may charge a man with beating her and it goes to court to decide, if the man was guilty of some sort of a crime, right? The discussions about abuse and about levels of abuse had solely to do with the requirements at the time of what made a man have to pay alimony. And we're not just talking about, basic needs. This was, he had to keep up a woman to the level of his standard life. In the case of George Ham, when his wife was taken away from his house, and this is kind of part of the fun story that's involved in the case, he had chastised his wife, and that could mean anything, right? And her father was very unhappy about the situation. She seemed to have complained to somebody. We don't really know exactly how it all went down. He shows up at the house and says, "To hell with you, my daughter deserves better than you." And his household was actually of a higher status than George Ham's household at the time. And he demanded his daughter to get into the wagon and come home with him, and bragged about how well off he was and how he could take good care of his daughter. Well, needless to say, George Ham was, nonplussed with the situation. He thought he'd been ill-treated both by his wife's gossip and by her father's actions. So after going and taking his child, saying, "Oh, can I hold my child?" and then taking the kid home with him, they ended up living apart for about 10 years. Over that 10 years, he went from being a shoemaker who did some farm work on his parents' house to being a rather well-off man. So after 10 years, all of a sudden, his wife says, "Look, I want to live with you." And the father wrote a letter of apology to him, which is actually quite telling. They're presenting it as if this man was a tyrant and created an unlivable circumstance for his wife. But the father's letter, when they decided that they wanted a little piece of this man's new money, wrote, "Dear Sir, I understand from your wife that in order to compromise the existing difficulty between you and her, but had you been in my place at the time, and with the feelings that then occupied my mind, I think you would have a more favorable opinion of my conduct. But if it has been of any injury to your interest or character in taking her away, I am sorry for it. And as it is her desire to return, my sincere prayer to Almighty God is that you may live in love and goodwill together, forgetting and burying in oblivion all former conduct. Excuse these detached sentences and judge my feelings of mind at the moment. I remain, dear sir, your well-wisher, signed Shelden Hawley." So, with a letter like that, we're still being asked to believe that this man was brutal, that he had beat his wife with a horsewhip and brandished it over her head in a threatening manner. And this is the precedent that Elizabeth Sheehy says this trial set. Now, first of all, it would be really, really strange for a trial that was a precedent-setting trial in Canada to not be reported. If a trial set a precedent, and that means that people were quoting it and they were referring to it, in other trials in the future, that somewhere somebody must have had the report, right? So there's the first lie. So let us count the lies. Number 1, that the case was unreported. Number 2, that it was precedent setting. They used a lot of precedents in the trial, but it didn't actually set any. The other precedents that were discussed at the beginning, in defense of the father trying to get support money from George Ham, his lawyer says, "Lord Kenyon held that where a wife's situation in her husband's house was rendered unsafe from his cruelty or ill treatment, he should rule it to be equivalent to a turning her out of doors, and that the husband should be liable for necessaries furnished for her under those circumstances." So what is ill treatment? A well-grounded apprehension of such injury, whether actually inflicted or not, is sufficient. Nor need it be an apprehension of being murdered or maimed. The fear of anything which comes within the meaning of the term bodily injury is a lawful cause for her quitting his house and resorting to the protection of some other person. In the trial they say, the old barbarous doctrine that a husband may beat his wife by way of correction is exploded in modern times. Such violence is illegal and may be the subject of an indictment or of sureties for the peace. Now, the rule of thumb doesn't actually enter into the words of this transcript whatsoever. Now, 2 things here. Rule of thumb was mentioned in a couple of courtrooms, but in every instance in the courts, they assured the courtroom that there was nothing in law that actually allowed for it. And you can see in here that all a woman needed was actually just the fear of being beaten, that she didn't have to produce any evidence of wounds on her body, because just the fear of it was, as is now, enough to allow her to leave with alimony. But she still had to prove it, and that was the problem in this case. Not that he had only beat her with a horsewhip or whatever it was he was being accused of, right? It was actually a horsewhip in this case. They failed to prove that he'd actually done it. Half the witnesses said that they'd never seen such a thing. Her sister said, well, I saw injuries on her that looked like pinch marks. Well, that was right after her father had removed her from the house, and she didn't want to go. She sat down. She refused to pack her things, and other people had to do it for her. So for all we know, it was the father that was pinching her. There was no actual evidence for it. And in the storytelling that came out, and the judge said, I've listened to both sides, witnesses for the defense and witnesses for the applicant, and there's actually no reason to believe that she had any reason to fear for her life. So he didn't set a precedent that a horsewhip was okay. That's what Sheehy wants you to think. What he just said to the jury, and this was decided by a jury, was that they couldn't really consider that to be part of it. So the other part of the case was, had he turned her away, either through his behavior or through his words? And at one point, after 10 years, they decided that they wanted a little piece of his wealth because he was a lot better off than when she first left him. This letter had been written by the father, and she went back and said, what do I need to do to appease you so I can move back in? And he just didn't want her back in the house again, so he made a whole bunch of rules that she had to follow if she wanted to be there. One of them was that he wasn't likely to sleep in her bed, but if he did so, she had to permit another man to be there. What didn't really get brought out too much was that he set that rule because she had apparently accused him of misbehavior, so he wanted a witness there as to the way he was treating her. But his intention was actually not to spend any time. He said, I'll give you the best room in the house, and if it's not good enough for you, I'll build another one. But if you're going to live in this house, it'll have to be completely separate from me. But in his list of regulations, he made it basically a list that she would not likely comply to, and she didn't comply to it. But also when he did that, he said, give me a month to decide how I feel. So what it came down to in the decision of the court was, did he owe money for alimony? Did he turn her out of the house? And they decided that for 1 month out of the 12 years, by the time the trial took place, it had been 12 years instead of 10, that for that 1 month where he said, stay at your dad's house while I figure out what I want to do, that he owed support money for 1 month. So essentially, the father and, as a result, the wife lost the case, and it was a case for alimony. That's purely what this case was about. And the discussions of beatings had nothing to do with what men were and weren't allowed to do. The sureties of the peace, mentioned at the end of that quote, was the main concern and the reason for the judgment. They said that if she was afraid for her life, if there was any evidence that he was threatening or abusing her, that her first course of action should have been to apply for a surety of the peace. Surety of the peace? Surely there wasn't such a thing back in a time when men were allowed to beat their wives. Well, yes, there's yet another lie. Women were protected. They were protected by the law of things that we would nowadays call a peace bond. So if a husband was ill-treating them, they were expected to go and to report it and to get a peace bond to protect them. And the parting of households was a last measure. So she didn't follow the correct order of events, and there wasn't evidence that there was any real threat. Because of those two things, they lost their case. And those decisions were based on previous precedents. This case itself set 0 precedents. So in conclusion, if you have any doubts or reservations about reading this case and whether it's worth your time or not, let me present to you George Ham as one of the first MGTOW. When his wife came to his house and said, I would like to move back in with you, he says, I'm not a better man than when you left. If you come live with me, you must look wild. If all be true, I have several children in the country, and I have a sweetheart in Montreal, much prettier than you are. His wife then said, George, that's nothing to the purpose. I want to know whether you'll live with me or not. Ham says, I am independent, king, lord of all. You must humble yourself very much before I tell you whether I shall live with you or not. I have the whip in my own hand, and I shall use it as I think proper. I will not tell you whether I will live with you or not until you go make friends with my mother. It was basically just a silly request to waste her time. So after all of that business, she says, now will you decide? Which is when he said, no, give me a month. Come back in a month and I'll tell you what I think. She says, can't we do it now? He says, I've got other things of more importance. She says, I think this is a business of great importance. And he says, you may think so, but I do not. That's as reported in the newspaper that Sheehy claims is the only source of the trial. You can read both if you want. George Ham, MGTOW hero. And now for the rape joke of the week. With all respects to Nephenor, who's given me so many awesome rape jokes, you're going to get sick of hearing his name in the future. I want to draw your attention to a new video by John the Other. So this week's rape joke is in honor of that, and a link to his video in the low bar. A feminist is walking down the street in East Vancouver. She turns into a dark alley. She sees a short, bald man wearing a Hawaiian shirt and flip-flops. She goes, I know you. You're John the Other. Are you going to rape me? Get a life. I don't give a fuck about rape. And keeps walking.